Hello everybody. Today I'd like to continue our discussion of agriculture. Last time we learned about the Green Revolution and we talked about how mechanization, fertilizers, and irrigation have changed the level of productivity of agriculture throughout the world. And today I want to finish up that conversation by looking at pesticides and genetically modified organisms. What are they? What are the impacts? And how can we regulate and manage these tools? So pesticides can include a lot of different things, but basically it's a chemical that you apply to kill some sort of pest. It could be broad scale, kills a lot of different things. It could be an herbicide that kills weeds that are competing with the crop that you're trying to grow. It could be a fungicide that kills a fungus that might be infecting your plants. It could be a rodenticide killing things like rats and mice that might be eating your vegetables or your fruit. Or it could be insecticides that are killing things like parasitic wasps, or perhaps, I don't know, aphids or anything that might be munching on your crops. Pesticides and fertilizers are not the same thing. If anything, they're actually kind of opposite. They're both chemicals that you apply to your crops, but pesticides kill pests. Fertilizers promote plant growth. Do not lump them together. They are very different. So the reason I'm talking about this is because the United States uses about 1/3 of all pesticides worldwide. If you look at this graph, we're looking at pesticide use since 1980, the past 40 years or so. Each color represents a different type of pesticide. And you could see that the use of pesticide has dropped a little bit since 1980, but it's stayed pretty high for the most part. And the reason we use so much is because it significantly decreases the amount of damage that's being done to our crops and therefore increases the yield and productivity of our farms. So that's a good thing. Unfortunately, there are a lot of environmental drawbacks to pesticides that I'm sure you could imagine. First of all, pesticide is going to kill let's say we're looking at a pesticide that kills insects, an insecticide. It's going to kill all insects for the most part, right? It might kill the insect you're trying to kill, but it might kill non-target species as well. Predators, beneficial predators or pollinators, nitrogen fixers, etc., right? A lot of these bugs play an important role in mitigating and managing the soil and the micro ecosystem, so you might be killing those accidentally. Additionally, pesticides will build up inside organic matter as you go up the food chain. This is something called bioaccumulation and biomagnification. We'll talk about that in more detail in Unit 8. But this is something that we see happening with a pesticide called DDT, building up inside of plankton. The plankton get eaten by fish. It builds up in those fish. The fish get eaten by larger fish, builds up a lot in those fish, and then the larger fish are get eaten by large birds of prey like bald eagles. So they end up with high amounts of pesticide in their blood. And if you look at this graph over time here, the number of Florida bald eagles nesting in Florida decreases substantially after DDT is started to be used in those farms there. Additionally, in regards to DDT, that was a pesticide that was used in the 50s and the 60s. Everybody loved it because it was really great at killing herbs, or weeds, I should say. It was an herbicide. But this woman who's an author and a scientist named Rachel Carson, she published a book called Silent Spring, all about the environmental and human health impacts of the overuse of DDT. And it brought so much public attention to this chemical that 10 years after her book was published, DDT was banned nationwide. Unfortunately, she never actually got to see DDT get banned because she actually died of breast cancer beforehand, and a lot of people speculate that cancer came from exposure to DDT because DDT not only is it bad for bald eagles, but it's also bad for humans to ingest. Additionally, overuse of pesticides can lead to resistance to those pesticides over time due to natural selection, so those will actually become less effective as time goes on. So if we use them too much, they will actually lose effectivity. They will lose efficacy. They will lose effectiveness, whatever. You know what I mean, over time. They can leach into the groundwater, infiltrate into the soil, and end up in the aquifers that we rely on for irrigation and for drinking, and that we don't want to ingest pesticides because, as I mentioned before, they can oftentimes be extremely toxic to humans, leading to cancer and disrupting our hormones and leading to failure of multiple organs, including the kidneys and the livers. So we really don't want to be ingesting pesticides. I mean, they are poisons after all, and so we don't really want them leaching into our groundwater. Thankfully, there's a lot of legislation that regulates pesticides to help reduce their use. The Clean Water Act addresses surface water pollution, so sets standards for pollution from a variety of different chemicals, but pesticides are one of them, and they test the water. The Safe Drinking Water Act addresses groundwater pollution, so pay attention to the difference. Clean Water Act is surface water. Safe Drinking Water Act is groundwater pollution, but it does similar things for groundwater and aquifer. The Delaney Clause of Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act helps regulate cancer-causing additives in foods and crops. This actually regulated pesticides until 1996, although not so much anymore. And lastly, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, also known as FIFRA, regulates pesticide, the sale of pesticides in the United States to protect the people who are applying the pesticides, the people who are buying the pesticides and consuming the products that pesticides are used on, as well as to protect the environment. They have a registry with the EPA of all the pesticides that are able to be bought and sold, with some pesticides being unable to be bought by individual citizens due to their toxicity, and they place fees and regulations for anybody who is using non-regulated pesticides. You are responsible for being familiar with these laws, so I would memorize them. Thankfully, though, there is a non-legislative approach we can take. Legislation is great, but it only goes so far. And a more sustainable form of pest management, instead of just spraying a crap ton of chemicals all over your crops, you can do something called integrated pest management. And the idea is that you're using a bunch of different approaches to controlling pests besides just chemical controls to minimize the environmental impact of your pest control. It is more expensive, right? But it is extremely much more beneficial and less harmful for the environment. So it's going to use a variety of things, including chemical controls, but also biological control and changes to the culture and the practices that you take on your farm. So, for example, the first changes that you will want to make, or if you're using IPM, there's this pyramid here from the EPA, with stuff at the things at the base being the things that are easiest for you to do, and the things that are the best for the environment, and the things towards the top of the pyramid are the sort of worse for the environment. So at the base of the pyramid for integrated pest management, right, changing the habits on your farm, right, keep maintaining good sanitation and good observation of your crops, monitoring the pest levels, etc. And then you can start looking at physical or mechanical prevention of pests using things like combs or crop vacuums, wearing proper clothing, setting up screens or nets around your crops to prevent bugs from getting in there or other pests. And then there's biological control, bringing in natural predators and parasites that can help limit the amount of pests in the area. And then as a last resort, you can then use chemical control with chemical pesticides. But even then, you can use things that aren't as toxic, such as spraying hot water or salty water to kill pests rather than poisons. You can also one of the habits that you can change is doing polyculture, where you grow multiple different types of crops that can help increase the biodiversity of your mini ecosystem, increase the health of the soil, and increase the resilience of your farm to encroaching pests. You can use pest-resistant varieties of plants to help prevent pests from ever taking hold. And then an example of a mechanical thing or a physical approach that you can use. This is pretty awesome. I love this. The crop vacuum. Look at that. Oh, what a monster, right? Where it drives over the crops and will, this is a giant vacuum that will suck the pests off the crops. Rather than spraying a bunch of chemicals to kill the crops, you're removing those crops without spraying a bunch of chemicals. It's a physical removal of those pests. Obviously, you are compacting the soil and using fossil fuels, so there are some drawbacks there. Additionally, another example of mechanical or physical pest control are boll weevil traps. Boll weevils are pretty detrimental to the cotton crop in the United States, and oftentimes farmers will use physical traps to catch them and monitor the populations and keep them informed as to sort of how invaded their farm is by the boll weevils. Beat the boll weevil. They're pretty bad guys. But additionally, there's also the biological control. Create habitats that are going to encourage the natural predators of pests. So these are all bugs that will help protect bananas from the various pests that can eat the banana fruit. These are all things that will help protect the apple crops from the pests that will come in and eat the apples. So creating a habitat that is going to encourage these populations of bugs to live there is going to help reduce the amount of pests you have as well. Not all bugs are pests, remember that. So, takeaway, right? Integrated pest management is a combination of a variety of different approaches, still using chemical control, but limited, and only using them when absolutely necessary. Trying to do other things before you go to chemical control. It's kind of like a last resort. Integrated pest management is not the same thing as organic. I'm waving my hands frantically around. You can't see that. Do not confuse them. IPM doesn't mean organic. Another way that we can control pests that isn't really through IPM or through the application of pesticides is by making genetically altered organisms. We can alter crops genetically to resist pests and resist diseases. The only downside, or not the only downside, but one of the downsides is it can lead to significant loss of genetic diversity within the crops. Now, when you think of GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, you might think of stuff like this. If you Google image GMO crops, these are the pictures you get. With some dude taking a syringe full of, I don't know what that is, blue water or bleach or something, and injecting it into an apple. This is a gross miscommunication about what a GMO is. Okay, this is not how GMOs are created, and this is not significant of what GMOs are by any means. First of all, technically, most of the food that we're eating is genetically modified. Anything that has been selected artificially by humans, the genes have been modified by us. We have artificially selected for all sorts of crops. Pretty much every crop you eat today has been genetically modified through artificial selection, as well as things like dogs. They're all genetically altered just through artificial selection. Now, where it starts to get a little bit more controversial is the idea of a transgenic GMO, where you take the gene from one organism and you splice it into the genome of another organism, and then allow those cells to duplicate and grow into a new plant that expresses a new gene. Again, you're not taking a syringe and injecting the plant, right? You're swapping the DNA out and culturing those cells to grow into a new crop, or a seed, which then you plant and grows into a crop. And these transgenic GMOs are good. Are they bad? Hard to say. One of the most famous transgenic GMOs is golden rice, which is genetically engineered to have increased vitamin D, which helps reduce the chance of someone going blind. But also there's some legal issues with using genetically modified crops, as companies are trademarking the genes that they're using. So increased pest resistance, which is great. They could be resistant to herbicides, so you can spray your herbicide all over your field and your crops won't die, but the weeds will. They could actually improve the yield of your crops. And like I said with golden rice, they might actually improve the nutrient content of the crop as well. And it might actually make things cheaper as well. We use genetically modified organisms to help produce insulin for those of us who have diabetes. There are a lot of drawbacks, of course. There is some controversy about whether or not there are negative health issues. As of the recording of this video, there's little to no evidence that genetically modified organisms have negative health side effects for humans. They may, however, sort of interbreed with wild relatives, and thus reducing the genetic diversity of these populations. And we know that lower genetic diversity reduces resistance to diseases. And also, like I mentioned earlier, the patenting of genetically modified organisms can actually end up screwing over some farmers. There's an interesting story about that on page 256 of your textbook if you want to check it out. But GMOs, whether you think they're good or bad, are more common than you realize. If you've eaten corn in the United States, you've eaten GMOs. About 96 to 97% of all corn grown in the United States is genetically modified through transgenic genetic modification. Soybeans, cotton, and corn are all highly genetically modified, both to be resistant to herbicides. HT stands for herbicide tolerant, or BT, which means insect resistant as well. So they're much more common than you realize in the United States and around the world as well. They are becoming much more common because they have a lot of benefits. And the last thing, are GMOs regulated? How are they regulated? There are no regulations in the United States that mandate regulation or labeling, things like this. The European Union bans many GMOs. Organic food in the United States cannot contain GMOs. That's really the only regulation, is that if you want your food to be organic, it cannot be genetically modified. Although, getting back to artificial selection, what isn't genetically modified? But that's splitting hairs, I suppose. The labeling is confusing because is there something wrong with GMOs? The label implies that there might be something wrong with it. It's GMO-free, maybe it's better, but there's no evidence that GMOs are negative for human health, so why the label? There are no actually regulations in the United States, so what's the deal with that? So we'll explore that topic a little bit more in class, and if you've got questions on pesticide use, integrated pest management, or GMOs, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next time.